Remember this portion of the story of God as it is written in the book we love, Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13, from the Inclusive Bible Translation. Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a wealthy landowner who, having received reports of a steward mismanaging the property, summoned the steward and said, 'What's this I hear about you? Give me an account of your service, for it's about to come to an end.' The steward thought, 'What will I do next? My employer is going to fire me. I can't dig ditches. I'm ashamed to go begging. I have it. Here's a way to make sure that people will take me into their homes when I'm let go.' So the steward called in each of the landowner's debtors. The steward said to the first, 'How much do you owe my employer?' The debtor replied, 100 jars of oil.' The steward said, 'Take your invoice, sit down quickly and make it 50. To another, the steward said, 'How much do you owe?' The answer came, 100 measures of wheat. And the steward said, 'Take your invoice and make it 80. Upon hearing this, the owner gave this devious worker credit for being enterprising. Why? Because the children of this world are more astute in dealing with their own kind than are the children of light. So I tell you, make friends for yourselves through your use of the world's goods, so that when they fail you, you'll be welcomed into an eternal home. If you can trust others in little things, you can also trust them in greater. And anyone unjust in a slight matter will also be unjust in a greater. If you can't be trusted with filthy lucre, who will trust you with true riches? And if you haven't been trustworthy with someone else's money, who will give you your own? Subordinates can't have two superiors. Either they'll hate one and love the other, or be attentive to the one and despise the other. You can't worship both God and money." This is the word of God for the entire world. Thanks be to God.
Well, here's the thing. I don't like this parable. It's weird. Jesus tells a story about a sketchy manager who gets caught cooking the books, and instead of condemning him, Jesus kind of applauds him. Like, "Nice move, way to hustle, well played." Excuse me, what? It's not the kind of story you embroider on a throw pillow. It's not the kind of passage you want your kids to memorize in Sunday school. This is the story you want to quietly slip under the rug because it doesn't quite make sense. But here's the thing. Jesus doesn't tell nice, tidy stories. He tells the kind that mess with you, the kind that make you uncomfortable, the kind that pull back the curtain and show you the ugly truth about how the world actually works. Here's the ugly truth. The whole economic system is rigged. It was true in Jesus' day, it's true in ours. The system squeezes the poor to keep the rich comfortable. The poor are always told they are the ones that are in debt, always owing, always behind, always trying to catch up. But from God's perspective, the script is actually flipped. It's not the poor who owe the rich, it's the rich who owe the poor. Ambrose, who was one of the early church fathers, said it this way: "When you give to the poor, you're not being generous, you're just paying back what you stole." That'll preach. But it will also clear out a room real fast. Alexa, lock the sanctuary doors.
Pastor Andy, I can't do that.
You can't do that because of safety?
No, my code doesn't allow me to help the poor. I work for a billionaire.
Because we would much rather believe our wealth is honest, that we earned it, that it belongs to us. But Jesus doesn't give us that out. He doesn't compare dishonest wealth with honest wealth. He compares dishonest wealth with true riches. Because as far as Jesus is concerned, all wealth is dishonest. Every dollar is tangled up in histories of land stolen, people enslaved, bodies exploited. Every dollar is touched by injustice, which is just really depressing and also really inconvenient. Because it means that when Jesus says, if you have not been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will trust you with true riches? He's not talking about someone else. He's talking about us. Jesus says, you cannot serve two masters. Our translation says you cannot serve God and money, but in other translations it's you cannot serve God and mammon. A lot of us grew up hearing that mammon just means money, but I think mammon is something quite bigger. It's more sinister. Mammon is money turned into a god. Mammon is wealth demanding loyalty. Mammon is the false promise of security. Mammon whispers, keep your head down, don't make waves, don't kneel in the street when they're painting over a mural, don't jeopardize your job or your ordination or your reputation. Mammon says, fall in line, stay quiet, play it safe, and you'll be secure. You'll keep your nightly show. But Jesus says, you cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve liberation and silence. You cannot serve truth and erasure. You cannot serve God and mammon. Liberation theologian Ernesto Cardenal once gathered peasants in Nicaragua to read this parable. And in the room were peasants and some visiting capitalists. The peasants got this parable instantly. They said, rich people's money is stolen money. And if you want to do something faithful, you flip it back to the poor. And they had this phrase they kept repeating, lo mismo, the same thing. They weren't playing a clever word game. They were naming a spiritual truth. For them, God and the people were not two separate loves. They were lo mismo, the same thing. To love God, to love people, the same thing. To resist mammon and resist empire, lo mismo, the same thing. To choose faithfulness or choose solidarity, lo mismo, the same thing. In their world, the connection was obvious because if your child was hungry and someone fed them, that was as holy as a prayer. If your neighbor was crushed by debt and you helped cancel it, that was as sacred as communion. Serving God was serving people, lo mismo. But the capitalists in the room hated this parable. They wanted to defend the rich. They wanted to explain away Jesus. They wanted to turn his parable into a fairy tale. And isn't that still happening? We've got Christian nationalists waving flags, baptizing empire, treating Jesus like a mascot for capitalism. But Jesus is not safe. Jesus is not tame. And Jesus is not a fairy tale. So what are the true riches that Jesus talks about? Not bigger houses, not padded retirement accounts, not silence that passes for safety. True riches are glimpses of the kingdom of God. Ada Maria Azea Diaz described it as coming together of peoples with no one excluded at the expense of no one. We see true riches when we give and receive without expecting repayment. When we share meals, when we donate to mutual aid, when we divest from empire's violence, like our United Methodist Church did recently, when we refuse to let dishonest wealth tie us to genocide of Palestinians. We divested. That's true riches, choosing justice over profit. And I've learned this the hard way. Because for a season in my life, I chose mammon instead. I tried to serve two masters. Almost 14 years ago, when I was serving in Lakeland, I held the same values that I hold today. I believed in inclusion. I believed in solidarity with the poor. I believed in liberation. But I was also trying my hardest not to go too far because I wanted to do well in the church. I had to know when to keep my mouth shut. I thought I could both serve God's people and stay loyal to a denomination that was harming them. I thought I could stand with farm workers in Immokalee without speaking truth to Publix executives who funded my paycheck. I thought I could hold solidarity in one hand and security in the other, but that doesn't work. It was like trying to keep one foot on the dock and the other on the boat. If you've done that for too long, you know eventually you land in the water. It made me sick, literally sick. I had 2 stress-related heart attacks before I was even 35. Because trying to serve 2 masters will tear you apart. And so I walked away from the church. I left it. I didn't know what was next. But in that in-between place, a queer, undocumented organizer found me while I was bartending, and he pointed me back toward the true riches of liberation. Felipe, as a dreamer in 2010, he marched alongside other dreamers 1,500 miles from Miami to Washington, D.C. on the Trail of Dreams to demand President Obama pass the DREAM Act. Felipe took time to show me that solidarity, not silence, is life. That liberation, not security, is joy. And that's eventually how I arrived at Allendale as the person that I am today. So when I talk about true riches, I'm not speaking in abstractions. I'm speaking about what saved my life. The riches in God's kingdom are not profit margins or denominational approval. They are compassion and solidarity and liberation. That's not money, that's not profit, that's life, that's healing, that's joy. And sometimes, like right now, when despair feels very heavy, we need someone else to remind us of the bigger story. Just this week, someone came into my office, sat across from me, and gave me a word of hope. They reminded me that history does not always move in one direction, that devastation does not get the last word, that empires fall and life breaks through in places that we least expect. They reminded me that in the 14th century, the Black Death swept across Europe and shattered feudalism. That whole system, unquestioned for centuries, collapsed under the weight of its own rot. And the church, corrupted by greed and power, was laid bare for what it was. But out of that devastation, something else began to rise. The Renaissance. New art, new thought, new science, new ways of being human together. That's how God works. Even in the ruins, God is sowing seeds of imagination. Even in collapse, God is stirring up a future. Even in what looks like death, God is already whispering resurrection. And here's the invitation: to look at our own moment, the authoritarianism, the corruption, the silencing, the erasure, and not just see despair, but to imagine what might be breaking forth even now in this moment. Because if God could bring renaissance from plague, God can bring liberation from fascism. If God could make art rise out of ashes, God can make justice rise out of our ruins. Authoritarianism doesn't last. Mammon doesn't last. And what looks like collapse might be the soil for rebirth. So yes, fascism is rising. Yes, Christian nationalism is thriving. Yes, mammon looks enthroned. Yes, Christian nationalism is loud, but it will not last. It never does. God's reign is breaking through. And friends, we're not the first to live through stuff like this. Karl Barth said no to the Nazis. He said the church cannot confuse God with nationalism. Dietrich Bonhoeffer went back to Germany when he could have stayed safe in America. He knew you cannot serve 2 masters. He knew that playing it safe is just another form of serving mammon. And now it's our turn. Now it's our time to choose God or choose mammon, to choose liberation or the safety of silence, to choose truth or erasure. And here's where I need to talk about this book we're starting as a church. We're going to be starting it next Sunday morning, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., or if you don't like to get up that early on a Sunday, you can join us on Monday nights on Zoom. It's called For Such a Time as This, an emergency devotional. And it's not some precious little feel-good daily reader with sunsets on the cover and words like blessed in cursive font. No, this book was written because the house is on fire. It takes us back to people like Barth and Bonhoeffer, people who lived through the rise of Hitler, through the breakdown of democracy, through a world that was unraveling in real time. And you know, one of the first things this book says, we've been here before, which is both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it means fascism is not new. Authoritarianism, propaganda, fear-mongering, not new. History rhymes. But it's also comforting because it means we're not the first people to ask, how do we stay faithful when the world is falling apart? This book is structured like a worship service. And I love that because when the world is coming apart at the seams, sometimes you don't need a clever argument or a new TED Talk. Sometimes you need the rhythm of worship to carry you. Think about it. Worship has always been the thing that holds us together when nothing else can. The liturgy is like muscle memory for the soul. When you're exhausted, when you've got nothing left, the prayers and the songs still carry you along. You don't have to invent new words for God. They're already waiting. So the book is shaped that way. It starts with gathering because before you can resist empire, you've got to find your people. You've got to remember you're not alone. Next, it moves to listening and responding. Because in the chaos of propaganda and lies, you need to hear another word, a truer word, and decide what to do with it. And then it moves to communion, because the bread and cup aren't just snacks, they're resistance. They say God's abundance wins over mammon's scarcity. And finally, sending. Because faith isn't something you keep locked up in here. It's what you carry out onto the streets, the protests, the school board meetings, the disaster recovery sites. The book takes us through that arc like worship does every Sunday, not because worship is an escape hatch, but because it's our training ground. It's where we practice being the people God calls us to be when we walk back out the doors into a world hell-bent on mammon. Because sometimes all you can do when you don't know what the hell is happening is keep worshiping, keep gathering, keep showing up, keep doing theology. It's not about finding the perfect strategy or the most eloquent manifesto. It's about doing our lives as confession, living as resistance. So this book we're going to do together reminds us to not let the empire tell us what matters, to not let fear tell us what our faith is about. It asks, when is the moment? When is the moment to stand up and say clearly what faith in liberation means? Not someday, not when it's safe, but maybe this moment. So when I read this book, I don't hear history. I hear it rhyming with today. Because authoritarianism is rising here too, because democracy is being hollowed out here too, because we are literally watching Christian nationalism wrap itself in flags and crosses and call it gospel. And friends, the church has been here before. That's the gift of this book. It reminds us that we are not alone. We are not the first. We don't have to reinvent resistance from scratch. We can learn from the witness of who came before us, and we can draw strength from them. We can draw courage in their failures and their faith. And this book also reminds us that resistance doesn't always look like blowing up the Death Star. Sometimes it looks very ordinary, like ordinary faithfulness, like telling the truth, like refusing to let fear be the loudest voice in the room, like practicing solidarity, like becoming a community that embodies true riches instead of hoarding dishonest wealth. Because what if that's what God is asking of us now? To resist mammon, to resist silence, to resist empire, by doing ordinary faith with extraordinary courage. I want to give you an update on my personal situation. Bruce Bartlett, the state attorney, with his discretion, has decided to move forward with my prosecution. Up to a year in jail for my refusing to cease praying upon a mural the governor desperately wanted erased. That's what mammon does. Mammon erases. Empire tries to silence, but our bodies, our witness, cannot be erased. So don't tell the governor this, but we are living murals. As we demonstrated outside the Woodson yesterday, recreating Black History Matters with our very bodies. That's what Jesus meant when he said, you cannot serve two masters. So don't serve mammon, don't serve silence, don't serve erasure. Serve people, serve love, serve truth, serve one another. Be living murals, because mammon falls, but kingdom endures forever. Amen.